For generations now, rumors have swirled that Billy the Kid's grave over at Fort Sumner was swept away by a massive flood. But is there any truth to the stories? And how can we be certain that Billy is actually buried under his current gravestone? Okay, so Fort Sumner, where the kid's allegedly buried, was first established as a military post in 1862. And over the next few years, the fort cemetery would welcome nearly 24 soldiers. Civilians would also be buried there after Lucian Maxwell purchased the fort in 1870, the most famous, of course, being Billy the Kid. He was laid to rest on July 15, 1881, right next to his old buddies Charlie Bowdre and Tom Folliard. And although a wooden cross was placed over his grave, it was soon riddled with bullets and stolen. And for over the next 3 decades, Billy's final resting place would remain completely unmarked. Skip ahead to the fall of 1904, and that's when the Pecos River rose from its banks, submerging the cemetery under about 4 feet of water. And from what I understand, this was not the only time that the graveyard was flooded. Apparently, it was also submerged back in 1889, and as a result of these 2 floods, there were a lot of people, myself included, who have been under the impression that some of the caskets or bodies may have been displaced, or at the very least, it would probably be next to impossible to determine where anyone was originally buried. More on that in just a moment, but later on in that same year, it was announced that the cemetery there at Fort Sumner would be shut down entirely. Per historian David G. Thomas, the decision was motivated by a desire to consolidate all state military burials, plus a concern that further Pecos River flooding would entirely wash away the old cemetery. Now, initially the plan was to relocate all of the bodies, but eventually they decided to just move the soldiers and leave the civilians where they were. And that particular task fell to a guy by the name of Charles Dudrow. Not only was Dudrow responsible for ensuring that the soldiers were dug up, but he was also to identify them, if possible, and then ship the remains to the National Cemetery at Santa Fe. This was not an easy task, to say the least. It's worth noting that the soldiers had been buried for nearly 40 years. Most of the graves were unmarked, but for those that were, the writing was completely illegible. Nevertheless, Mr. Dudrow got it done. He started off interviewing the old-timers who lived at Sumner, just trying to gather as much information as possible. Remember, this was in 1906, so there were still a lot of people alive who both knew Billy the Kid and who had attended his funeral. So that being the case, Dudrow soon had himself a hand-drawn map, marking not only where the soldiers were buried, but also the location of Billy and his quote-unquote gang members. Once again, per historian David G. Thomas, quote, Dudrow successfully located the known military burials and made strenuous efforts to ascribe an identity to each set of the remains, although he was ultimately unable to do so. He obviously was a meticulous worker. This gives his identification of Billy's, Bowdre's, and Folliard's graves formidable credibility. The Dudrow map provides the best historical documentation of the location of Billy, Bowdre, and Folliard's graves that exists, end of quote. And by the way, just in case you're curious, Dudrow did not exhume Billy or any of the civilians. He was only focused on the remains of the soldiers. You can also find on his map where he listed the graves of several children, and none of them were disturbed either. Now, we'll check back in with Billy in just a moment, but what Dudrow found when he began to crack open those soldiers' caskets is very interesting. The remains of each and every one were in a fine state of preservation, and the entire skeleton of everyone secured. The bones were dry and clean and no odor noticed, except in one instance, and then only very slightly. So in other words, despite the cemetery flooding at least twice, the bodies of the soldiers were left remarkably intact. And even more importantly, not a single one of them was missing. They were all located exactly where they were planted back in the 1860s. According to the March 3rd edition of the Albuquerque Evening Citizen, quote, the bodies were disinterred, put into coffins, and sent by teams to Santa Rosa. From there, they were shipped over the El Paso and Southwestern to Santa Fe, and will arrive Saturday next, it is expected. There were 22 of them, and they will be placed in the National Cemetery west of the city of Santa Fe. The names, companies, and regiments to which the soldiers belonged have been preserved and will be placed on the headstones of their graves. Records of these are kept in the Quartermaster's Department in Washington by Superintendent of the National Cemetery in Santa Fe, end of quote. Now, following the 1926 publication of the very popular book, The Saga of Billy the Kid, people began flocking to the cemetery. But unfortunately, there was still no headstone marking the kid's grave, so the tourists were having a hard time locating it. I won't bore you with the entire history of Billy the Kid's various markers, but he did receive a new one, described by a local paper as being octagonal in shape, in 1927. The only problem was it was placed in the wrong location. According to the El Paso Herald on August 25th, 1927, quote, "In the old graveyard, now overgrown with range grass, there is a marker bearing the name of Billy the Kid. The story here is that the marker was misplaced and that, grim irony of fate, it adorns the grave of Joe Grant, one of the kid's victims via the six-shooter." End of quote. Now, I don't know how true that is as far as it being placed over the grave of Joe Grant, but I did have a very hard time finding out additional information regarding this octagonal marker. I don't know who placed it there, and I don't know what became of it. At first, I was thinking maybe they were describing the smaller marker that you can find at the foot of the grave, but that wouldn't be installed until 1940. Double check me on that 1940 date, but it was much later than 1927. I even spoke with Tim Sweet, the longtime operator at the Billy the Kid Museum over at Fort Sumner, and even he was unable to provide extra context. I also emailed historian David G. Thomas, author of the excellent book Billy the Kid's Grave, but as of this recording, I have not yet received a reply. That said, if the second marker really was placed in the wrong spot, the mistake was rectified just a few years later in 1930. That's when 4 of those old-timers there at Sumner set out to locate the grave's exact location once and for all. And these 4 men were Paco Anea, Jesus Silva, Vicente Otero, and Charles Four. Mr. Four being the only one who didn't personally know the kid. But be that as it may, he did arrive at Sumner just a few months following the kid's death, so he would have almost certainly noted the grave back when it was still fresh. As for Anea, Silva, and Otero, they were all present there at the fort when Garrett killed the kid. They helped prepare the body for burial and even served as pallbearers during the funeral. There is no doubt whatsoever that they had once known where Billy the Kid was buried. The only question is, could they still remember nearly half a century later? Well, apparently the answer is yes, at least according to them. Not only did all 4 men agree on the location, but they even had a concrete curbing placed around the graves. And then just a year later is when they commissioned the current large granite marker. And just a quick FYI, a lot of people are under the assumption that someone snuck into the cemetery late at night and carved the word "pals" on the headstone, just like we were all told at the end of Young Guns. Turns out that is not the case. The word "pals" came etched into the marker by the manufacturer. Okay, so here's where things get really interesting. When Silva and the others located Billy's gravesite in 1930, they were unaware of the 1906 Bowdre map. In fact, historians wouldn't even learn about the map until the 1990s. If you'll recall, Bowdre had marked the location of Billy's grave based on information from the old-timers like Anea, Silva, and Otero. And when you compare the location on Bowdre's map to the spot where the granite marker currently stands, which is the same location that Anea, Silva, and Otero and Four all agreed upon back in 1930, they line up damn near perfectly. The only question remaining is whether or not Billy's casket was physically washed away during the Great Flood of 1904. Keep in mind that when Bowdre was reinterring the soldiers, he noted how well preserved their bodies were. And like I said earlier, he was able to account for all 22 of them. Not a single soldier had been lost in the flood. In fact, even as late as 1905, after the flood, their burial mounds were still visible. Look, I don't know about you, but as far back as I can remember, I've always heard stories about Billy's remains being washed away. In fact, I heard it repeated so often that I just sort of assumed it was true. But as it turns out, that is not necessarily the case. While there was most definitely a large flood in the fall of 1904, there is zero evidence whatsoever that the remains of Billy the Kid, or anyone else for that matter, were displaced. No caskets were found floating down the river, no empty holes, nothing like that. These were just simply rumors. So, that said, based on the information we now have at our disposal, the excellent condition of the soldiers' remains, coupled with the Bowdre map, and the affirmation of said map 25 years later, I do think there's a very likely chance that Billy the Kid is still resting either underneath or within just a few feet of that large granite marker that still bears his name. Now, if you're interested in learning more, I would strongly suggest picking up a copy of David G. Thomas's book, Billy the Kid's Grave. Mr. Thomas is very diligent when it comes to research, and he includes a ton of information on the history of Fort Sumner, as well as a breakdown of events following the kid's death. You would be amazed at how often Billy the Kid's grave markers have been stolen. I'll drop a link down below if you'd like to give it a read. And I'd also like to extend a shout out to Ben Doss. Today's episode was originally just something that I sent out in my newsletter a long time ago. And when I was doing my initial research, I found an article written by Doss that proved extremely valuable. But unfortunately, I'm no longer able to access it. Not sure if he moved it somewhere else or it's just a broken link or what, but Ben is extremely knowledgeable when it comes to Billy the Kid history. Matter of fact, if you'd like to check out some of his work, you can go over to the Chasing Billy YouTube page and click on the Post tab, and you should be able to find several write-ups by Ben under the name Das Boot. They are always extremely interesting and very insightful. So thank you, Ben, for your excellent work. Thank you, David G. Thomas, and thank you, the audience, for joining me. I hope you'll do the same next week as we finally take a stab at the great Jesse Evans. Who the hell was he, and what became of him after he escaped from prison? Until then, adios.